Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Angelo Fick. I am the chair for this session, which is session 6, Food, Aesthetics and Politics, and I'd like to invite the 3 speakers in the session to come up to the stage, please. Okay, welcome everybody. Our 3 speakers this afternoon are Pralini Naidoo, Shari Daya, and Ben Jameson Stanley. I'm going to hand over immediately to Pralini Naidoo, who is going to present a paper called The Unwritten, a poetic exploration of the recipe beyond and between the lines. Thank you, Pralini.
Thank you, Angelo. Okay, I'm going to just jump straight in. Okay, so straight in. Many years ago, my old boss asked me to share my mutton curry recipe. So with great diligence, I went home to create a dish which until then had just danced on my taste buds and memory. I carefully noted the ingredients, measurements, more or less, and method, right down to the sizzle sounds. And that evening, my roommate and I had a feast on my really amazing, taste like home mutton curry. I gave thanks to all my co-creators from this and other realms and handed this my tried and tested recipe to the old man the next day. I included a few teaspoons of my spices, just so that he wouldn't go wrong. Bossman tried out the recipe on the weekend and on Monday complained that it just didn't taste like real curry. This got me thinking, what was real curry? Was there really one curry? So curry, as I've since discovered, is a colonial concept which homogenized various dishes into a single category. And this curry obviously needed to taste a particular way to satisfy my boss's colonial taste buds. So this curry, and I, as what I gathered must have been an ethnic other, did not fit his idea of paka, and therefore it was not. This made me consider the idea of recipes, how they are transferred and where they reside and how they change as they must. And I've been considering the recipe and its importance to the food narrative. Recipes guide our food how to and what do I need questions when we are trying to recreate a favorite or an old or new meal. So with Google on hand, I can check what I have in my fridge, type said items into my search menu, and voila, I will more than likely find a recipe for those very ingredients. Sadly, however, I rarely find the taste of home on Google, or for that matter, within recipe books. So I decide to consult. Very aware that in a country that still conceptually ties us to 4 constructed race groups, ethnic foods are often framed within these rigid racial categories, often without an understanding of specificity, difference, and nuance to the various lived realities. So I decide to look at private ways of documenting. I consult Amma's handwritten recipe books, the first 2 very grubby books on my slide. I decide to consult the books and Amma, my mother, for some clarity and perhaps for a taste of my childhood. Amma was a school teacher, junior primary. She spent a great deal of time making charts: A for apple, B for ball, C for cake. You get the drift? It makes sense that Amma has her recipes tagged, as you can see. Biscuits, cakes, sweetmeats, savories, miscellaneous. Her pages are numbered in green pen. Her headings are underlined, sometimes in frilly. Her headings are also quite frilly. Neat schoolteacher cursive. I smile at the book's optimistic beginnings of structure and order, knowing that Amma's recipe book is a living, breathing thing. The book grows, the headings no longer lined, the neat cursive becomes artistic scribble. In many ways, the book is Amma's wish list, the recipes she would like to try. So I find 5 different recipes of muruku, each with its own bracketed name next to it. This is how Amma could remember her preference. Lorraine's appam was a winner, so was Krishni's scone recipe and Tammy's vada. But this bracketing of names was also recognition and acknowledgement of the source of her recipes, a way of honoring the creativity and skills of her friends, family, and sometimes even strangers. It was a bricolage of Your Family magazine cutouts, tips and tricks hastily taken down from the radio, guest writers, me and my sister, an old envelope with nursery rhymes that my children had taught her, a list of dances. My mother was a dancer. The slide, the Macarena, the hanky-panky, which she had rehearsed with senior citizens. So here lay her wish list of things that she would like to have tried out next. Amma's book was also full of adaptation. Along the way are microwave adaptations and of old favorites. She was a working woman. Perhaps this new invention would speed things up. When Amma married Papa all those years ago, she discovered high tea, a decadent Naidoo tradition which Ava and Tata had appropriated from the British. It was a very sugary affair. Years later, Amma blamed this tradition of high teas for her diabetes. High tea had suited the 4 of us, because as children of school teachers, we all arrived home around 3 p.m., ravenous. And tea created that little stopgap that allowed Amma to cook without a hungry family wandering around, asking where the food was. It's no wonder that Amma's recipe book begins with biscuits and cakes, and of course, sweetmeats. But where were her food recipes? Her khichdi and chutney, which we often ate on a Tuesday night, the braised butternut with mustard seeds and cinnamon sticks, the brinjal and double beans, dark and tart with tamarind, her curried dal with brinjal and sour herbs, the braised red and green amaranth, which she often tossed into white potato. We used to call this prayer food. Amma usually made a variety of vegetable dishes on prayer days, a luxury for me, the only vegetarian in the family at the time. Prayer food, this for me is a taste of home. And I don't see these recipes in her book because Amma didn't need a recipe book to make them. I didn't learn to cook Amma's curries from her because as a child and teenager, I was busy dabbling in her wish list of recipes, laminating croissants and filling up the biscuit tin for a week of high tea. So I close her book and I think about her food. Amma was a storyteller. And this is how she introduced us to our grandmother, who had died long before my sister and I were conceived. Amma's gift of story had breathed life into an ancestor who could easily have been erased. There was usually food involved. When we were younger and when time allowed, Amma fed us, mixing with her fingers rice and butter with whatever braised chutneys and curries the adults were eating. And after story time, I would try to recreate the taste of those mushed up rice bowls, which Amma popped into our waiting goldfish-like mouths. It never tasted the same. There was a special alchemy in that combination of Amma's story Amma's food, Amma's fingers, and Amma's ancestors. Now, as a result, I can reach into the memory of this ritual to summon up the flavors of that kitchen. Her braised pumpkin, cauliflower, peas, dal with brinjal. I can mush them all together with my fingers, feed myself, and feel whole and held. More importantly, however, I can tap into her gift of story, to breathe life into her, to make sure that she isn't erased or invisibilized. In a kitchen cupboard just above my stove, buried amidst bottles of dry spices, is Amma's old coffee grinder with a deeply cracked plastic lid, a no-name brand, a little beaten up. For me, an heirloom. After Amma died, I asked Papa if I could have it. Not her jewels or saris or handbags. I wanted her old coffee grinder with its deeply cracked plastic lid. I carefully bandaged the lid with duct tape to seal in the memories of Amma's kitchen. The recipe book lies open to the page which says braised pumpkin, a list of what and how, neat words on glossy paper. I smile at the measurements and instructions. Hauling out the ingredients I need for this meal, I close another book and look for Amma's coffee grinder with its deeply cracked plastic lid. I feel like Aladdin as I open the lid, and images of another time snake into presence. My pots are on my stove. I hear Amma's bangles jingling as she throws in the mustard seeds and red chilies, sniffing and humming as they sputter. I slice my onions lengthwise, knife against thumb, straight into the pot, like her. No fancy chef skills. And then I sneeze, like her, loudly. Onions have that way of irritating our sinuses. I remember that she roasts her jeera and song in a frying pan on the stove. And I know that she doesn't add these to her vegetables, but I will. I lean in towards the warmed up spices and then place them in the coffee grinder with the deeply cracked plastic lid. My kitchen is momentarily transformed into hers, the shrill sounds of blades transforming seed to powder, fine plumes escaping through emerging cracks. It is an act of deep invocation, flexing an intergenerational muscle. I stir the onions and add the pumpkin. Psh! Don't bang the spoon on the pot, a voice in my ear. On good days, multiple ancestors arrive. Ava, who didn't use a coffee grinder, would lean into her grinding stone, her sun-dried spices powdered by the weight of her entire being. Sometimes Papa arrives too. My braised pumpkin reminds me that he too could invoke the taste of home. He could bring Amma and Ava back into his kitchen long after both had become ancestors. His own version of mint chutney is not in Amma's book, but lives in a voice recording of a family WhatsApp call just before he died. Some days, none of the ancestors arrive, and I'm on my own, reframing and re-envisaging the tastes of home. For now, however, the food is made and mixed and served. The ancestors have arrived, and this particular story has been told.
Thank you so much, Pralini, for that really moving and at the same time quite illuminating description and analysis of not only a mother's relationship with a daughter and a daughter's relationship to her mother through these texts, but also with the very notion of authenticity and learning and the play between the remembered, the textual, and the experienced. Are there any direct questions from the floor? Right, I'll read some of them. There is, I think, from Vasu Reddy. Pralini, my memories are likewise triggered by the stories you share about recipes, methods, tools, and rituals shaping food. What exactly then is the unwritten, yet what you do is to write history and experience into history, which I think also was for me about, it echoes something that I had wanted to know about, this missing material of the mother's legacy that you speak of, the stuff she doesn't write down. What significance does that have when it comes to writing about such an intimate and now one imagines an experience in the past that is also still precious and tender?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Am I responding to Vasu or am I responding to Angelo?
No, I think go with Vasu,
I think that's
who wants to know about how you write
so.
history and
What
experience.
exactly is the unwritten? Yet what you do is right. Yeah, so I guess it is in a way writing about an experience which would kind of, I guess, in a way, would muddy the idea of there being one story. This is a particular story, but even in its particularness, it changes and it lives and it's and it isn't just one story, because I could go back to Amma's recipe book and find that the recipe has changed. So this idea of going back for me is, it actually isn't about going back. It's just sort of having a conversation very much in the present with stuff that one might feel is archival. So I look at her written text, right? And I find that there's subtext in this written text. And I am looking for a particular story, which I don't find in the subtext, but I'm reminded of the complexity of my childhood. Never mind just looking for a particular taste, but I'm reminded of the complexity of my mother and her various sort of, roles and aspirations and whatever it is, and then come back to this taste, which I'm probably imagining. So it's a very living thing, and it's not meant to be the story. It's one of the stories. I'm not sure if I'm sticking to what Basu was alluding to.
No, I think there is a response there which I quite like, because it does open up this idea of you are in essence, sort of linking text to experience. But on the other hand, you're also looking at text that is generated by an other who happens to be your mother. So you have some things that you think you have access to because you're the daughter or the child, but there's a whole other thing about why she wrote the way she did, why she does the things you do that you're now ascribing meaning to. And do you ever come up against resistance where you kind of find something that encodes a version of that other / mother that you didn't know, can't quite contextualize? Is the journal of the recipe book ever foreign or strange or uncanny?
That's a really good question. Always, always. We can never know. We can never know everybody in all their aspects. So, I was chatting to my sister yesterday, and she remembers things in a totally different way to how I remember them. So, in storing, there were a lot of overlaps, but in storing, there's just a lot of, who is doing the storing. I'm always a bit aware of that. And so for there to be a real sense of curry, or one particular way of looking at it, is just completely bizarre. So even within a family, we would story that curry in a different way, you know. And sometimes the ancestors arrive and sometimes they don't. And my daughters will remember it differently too, you know. So the complexity is important, I think.
I'm checking the chat. I'm not seeing further questions, and we have about 8 or so more minutes for us to kind of engage on this. So you spoke about how you went looking for certain kinds of recipes, and they turned out not to be there. You know, so let me read the 2 things that have come in. 3 things. One is, I'm interested from Shari in how you think of this piece in terms of genre. Do you think of it as memoir, autoethnography, personal history, or something else? And Ben asks, Pralini, I was really interested in your comment that the problem of rigid racial categories is tied to ideas about food, like the colonial category of curry tending to homogenize different foods, as opposed to your own recipe, which was originally unwritten. I'm curious if you think that taking an unwritten recipe and writing it down inevitably tends to ossify, to try to take something in flux and fix it, or are written forms open to change? And then Desiree Lewis's comment is, among other things, I find this very refreshing response to much other scholarly work on recipe books and recipes. Could you comment on your sense of scholarly work on recipes and recipe books?
Okay. Yeah, so I think in sort of inserting a very, so yes, okay, let's go to the first one. Interested in genre. So yeah, there are elements of autoethnography. I find that autoethnography allows us to be quite specific and to be quite particular and look at particular lived experience. I don't privilege, I mean, I don't, what can I say? It's not a hierarchy. So my sense and expression does not have to put another expression or lived reality or experience of whether it's the recipe or the curry or, you know, Durbanness or whatever, Indianness or whatever it is. It's not representative at all. And I find the idea of looking at the particular, is very important when we are wanting to we want easy universalisms, you know. So, you know, my gut response to my boss would have been, what do you know about curry? You know, it would have been a defense mechanism or whatever it was. But it did make me think, you know, what was his idea? What was this idea of real curry? What was that thing? Did it even exist? It was, you know, and it wasn't saying that my recipes were now authentic, because they change all the time as well. But to kind of trouble this idea that there's a universal, as who was putting it, Shari, of fixing it. And you know, when there's this idea of alchemy, when there's various things that are entangled, we cannot fix. We cannot fix. It is quite a unique combination of things that happen at any given point. But again, the idea of writing our ancestors into life is also important, and that this memory is not lost. So it could happen that I have a particular invocation of Ama's curry, so does Papa, so does my sister, and so we make this complex individual who's my mother. Not just recipe, but all aspects of her life. So the idea is not to fix. Among other things, my reservation response. Yeah, so, you know, my work is not primarily on recipes. My work is to do with seed, and it's, you know, sort of so tangentially looks at the idea of food narratives which are, because I look at food seed. So if I do have time to answer that, food seed suffers from a very similar kind of fixing, to use your word, Shari, of a very particular people who narrativize or story seed, and ways in which that they do that. And often it's a colonial narrative, looking at so even looking at GMO, and then the response to GMO, and then the idea of what is indigenous, and the kinds of binaries there. So I'm looking more at that. So tangentially, it is still related to this idea of who gets to tell the story and why. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pralini. I've been told that we're expected to wrap up the session, so we can hold up some questions from the floor, and you can maybe think about further responses for the closing discussion at about 5:15. Our next speaker is Shari Daya, whose presentation is Meat in Black and White.
It took me a while to turn myself on, but I think I am now on. Thank you, Angelo. And thanks, Pralini, for that really beautiful reading. I won't get to read the full poem that I'm opening with, but it's just a really beautiful poem that kind of honors food, honors the kitchen table and domestic spaces. And if you get a chance, please go and look up Joy Harjo's work. I will move straight on in the interest of time to my presentation. So the paper that I'm presenting today comes out of a 3-year research project that ran into 4 years, and it's now wrapping up at the end of its 5th year, thanks to COVID. And the project was on middle-class food practices in Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg. And in this project, so I'm a geographer, cultural geographer, and this was a geography social science project. We were trying to understand some of the links between food, identity, mainly race and class identity, and ethics. And by ethics, we meant not just the kind of big E ethical questions that might play out in organic food, local food, free-range food, but also the kind of small e ethical questions, or what we might call the ordinary ethics, of how food is linked to practices of care and to everyday judgments about what is good. Methodologically, we try to gather sort of rich, textured food stories from people in a range of middle-class neighborhoods in South Africa, with the aim of saying something about what people think counts as good food. And to get these stories, we undertook a range of qualitative methods, interviews, focus groups, but also accompanied shopping trips and co-cooking sessions with people in their own homes. So we can talk about the methods for the project later if people are interested. And we can also talk about class identity and how we thought about middle class if people are interested, because when I present, that's something that people are very keen to unpack, but I don't really want to go into it now, so we can pick up on it later. So in thinking about food and identity, there's a lot of literature out there on food and identity, a lot of it produced since the 1960s, especially in disciplines like anthropology and sociology, but very, very little of that looks at contemporary African societies, and even less of it looks at urban African societies. So North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, even Asia and Latin America are all quite well represented in studies of food culture and identity. Reading the scholarly work about African dynamics in food and identity relationships, it's hard to conclusion that Africans are hungry and very little else. And there's an example from this book, which again, I won't go into in the interest of time, but basically it just sort of spans the globe and says, that we also look at hunger in Africa, and that's it. And then we move on. Now, of course, far too many Africans are hungry, and the reasons for this desperately need to be addressed. They're pretty well understood, but they desperately need to be addressed. However, our approach in this project on food identity and ethics was to say, surely there's much more going on with regard to African food cultures, both historical and contemporary, both rural and urban, perhaps even traditional and modern, than we generally get to read about. And so we went looking for stories about identity, sociality, meaning, pleasure, desire, memory, mundanity, labor, anxiety, and joy, and all sorts of other emotions and feelings, which we felt were as relevant and important here as in the minority, so-called developed world, where these kinds of stories get told with much greater regularity. So I really like this quotation from Desiree Lewis, who I think is in the room, where she says that scholarship on African food should focus not only on constraining relationships and discourses, also on liberating and creative ones. And that was something that we took very seriously in this research. And so we try to elicit stories about how people made judgments about the food that they bought and cooked and ate. And when I started going through the hundreds, 1,000 actually, pages of transcripts and notes that we had collected over the years, I was struck by how often meat was mentioned. So meat wasn't actually something went into the project to ask about. It wasn't a topic on our interview guides, but meat was talked about in pretty much every conversation. And I was struck reading the data, not only by the frequency with which meat was discussed, but also by the depth of thought and feeling that was invested in these fragments of conversation. It became clear that meat was more than just another food. Meat has a peculiar power. It's a food to define who we think we are in this place, in this time. And so I went looking for some critical social science writing on meat, and I didn't find all that much. And if people in the audience know of more, please point me to it. But my conclusion was there's just not a huge amount of research in food studies on meat specifically. That said, there is some recent work that highlights the deep ambivalences and complexities that are often entangled in meat production and consumption. And I wanted to just refer to two examples. Jonathan Safran Foer's recent book, Eating Animals, which is his own personal exploration of factory farming in the US and is surprisingly gripping all the way through. And then a geographer, Leah Gibbs, has unpacked some of these tensions very effectively in her work on animal geographies, which explores meat as the product of both care and killing, or what has come to be called the meat paradox. And basically, we can express the meat paradox as we love animals, but we eat animals. So as these two examples suggest, the focus of most meat research in the critical social sciences is on the relationship between the animal and the eating human. So that's the relationship scholars are interested in. And this meat paradox certainly appears in the stories that we have collected. But maybe surprisingly, what emerged more strongly than human-animal relations in these particular meat narratives are human social dynamics. I don't know if this is for me. The thoughts about meat often spill onto identity in the South African context, giving shape and form to senses of who I am and who they are. With about meat and identity in various places, the identity that people seem very interested in is sex, gender. So that relation between meat and masculinity, meat and femininity. But in our data, it wasn't sex, it was race that seemed to give meaning to meat, and vice versa. So here was a really interesting quotation from our data. One of our participants said, "I eat like a black person." There was came with meat, and I was about 10 years old. It was the day before, and then when she was cooking it, it was black. That day we didn't eat the meat. My uncles and grandfather ate the meat. And then my grandfather asked if they liked it, and they said they did. And he asked if they wanted to know what they were eating, and he asked them to guess the animal. And then my grandfather told them they were eating an elephant. With black people, we don't eat stuff like that. We can't eat elephant, but white people can eat the elephant. Like, you know, in China or Japan, they eat cat, but here we don't eat cat. And then my uncles were running to the bathroom to go make themselves throw up. So this story was one of several that explicitly connected meat and race. And part of my reason for writing this paper was to try and understand what are the connections. Sorry, I've got a message that says turn camera and mic on, but am I good? Myself.
I think you have a poor connection, but your audio is still available. So I think we can see your screen and we can hear you.
Okay, that's great. As far as I can see, my camera is also on, so I'll just carry on. Yeah, so I wrote this paper to try and understand what are the connections between meat and identity, and particularly racialized identity in contemporary South Africa. So in which we make race. And in some examples from our data, meat specifically racializing the other. So there are three themes that I want to pick up in my minutes. And the first is how meat is used to racialize the other. The second is meat as generative of Black culture in South Africa. And then the third theme is on white and meat. So this was one participant who said there's a Black participant speaking, and she's talking about somebody who said to her, oh, these vegan politics, when she said that she's a vegetarian, these vegan politics are they're upper class. It happens so many times that at first I was probably offended about it, but it's because it's like, am I not Black enough? Now I'm less offended. This was a different participant who said, now I eat meat, but not that much. I did some work with a group of white Dutch students, and each time it was lunch or dinner, they'd always see a piece of meat left on my plate. They would say, hey, why are you leaving meat? You're South African and you don't like meat. Are you even from Africa? They think, oh, you're from South Africa, you must love it. And then this was from a focus group where one speaker says, of course, the eating habits of the Black people have changed as well. In those days, fillet was a useless piece of meat. They weren't interested in it at all. And then another speaker says, oh, they like the fat. I know, it's got to have the bone. And then they talk about, because the Black people, they would rather have a piece of bone with their meat, and they emphasize the fat again and how important that is. So in each of these extracts, there's a presumption that of a raced and or classed other are known. And my argument in the paper is that in that presumption, there's an undercurrent of violence, which is the violence of stereotyping. And so how do we make sense of these stories? The first quotation is a Black participant feeling judged on her by another Black person. The other two are of white subjects pronouncing on Black food preferences. Interesting, because the participant's question, am I not Black enough, makes it clear that in the context of South Africa, where race and class are so entangled, the class-based critique also as a race-based critique. And we can't know what the speaker meant, but it's highly likely that what the experiences as a challenge to her Blackness was inflected with such a judgment. And even if not, this is her experience of the moment. But there's a qualitative difference of what happens in that encounter and then the violence enacted by the white speakers in the other two exchanges. Because in those two accounts, the white speakers not only assume that they know what a Black person like to eat, but they explain that knowledge in terms of their race. So there's a lot more to say about what's going on in these encounters, but these stories illustrate race and culture are made real through acts of othering, and how they can be wielded against food choices in ways that restrict and diminish Black personal and collective power. Psyche Williams-Forson, and her fantastic book on race and food in the US. So food can be a very powerful people, as we know from colonialism and apartheid. And although the legislation governing the trade of food and access to food is no longer explicitly racialized in South Africa, what these narratives demonstrate is how persistent imaginative restrictions can be voices and the capacities and aspirations of Black people. I want to very quickly to the next. So this is the second theme that we pulled out of the meat narratives, which is about how meat can be generative of culture in a much more agential and kind of positive way. So there are examples of how meat is used to give meaning to racial identity in ways, so the previous example is about limiting people's capacities, but this is much more generative of culture, opening it up rather than shutting it down. And so this is a speaker talking about, the difference between slaughtering the cow for and buying packaged meat. And they say now when you're buying packaged meat to feed the family, the cultural essence of it is lost. There's another quotation from a participant who talks at boarding school in Zimbabwe and the politics around meat. And they say you would get one piece of meat and on weekends it would be chicken, which was like, wow, it was intense. And if you were dating someone, the big thing was like you would get their chicken. Chicken became part of like the economy of romance. And then finally, even on that, this is a different speaker, even on that chicken, you can't just come and say, I'm going to have that piece. Each and every piece belongs to someone. There's a piece that the father, the mother, the elder son, the grandchild must eat. Sometimes, when they used to slaughter a chicken, most of us, the grandchildren, only eat, the insides. Yes, only all the meat has been distributed to the elders. So these narratives start with an animal and they travel to become a story about meat, and that in turn opens up into a story about Black identity and traditions, some long-standing through generations like this one, and some more contemporary like the boarding school example. And the three stories are all about how meat in its materiality, its moo, its protein, its vitamins and fat, create relations of care, celebration, respect, and even romance. So each story here gestures participant spoke about as, quoting, the cultural place meat has in Black African life, like cultural life. Okay, so I know I've got 5 minutes left. So our data told us some things about Black identity. It also told us some things about whiteness. And I found this really interesting because reading for whiteness in the data required absence. And there was a double, if not triple absence here. So first of all, very few of our white participants, and about a third of the participants were white. Very few of them related their meat practices to their racial identity in the way that Black speakers did. So to put it another way, in white narratives about meat, whiteness itself is pretty much invisible. Then the second absence is that where meat and whiteness were pulled together in the stories that we gathered, usually in a narrative by a Black speaker, it was often through meat as an absence. So where the two cross into each other's paths, it was through accounts of vegetarianism, veganism, health, and environmentalism, and quite amusingly, salad. So one of the quotations was, the Black people, this is from a Black participant, the Black people that care about their health and are all like salady and whatever, it's associated with whiteness, that side of things. Someone else told us there's a slang word, not sure if it still applies for people like me. People with accent and had a particular command of the English language were called salads. In Shona, you would say musalad, and musalad is someone who is, fancy, which is white. And then they go on to say, I can make salad, but I don't. And for me to say I don't make salad is, I'm sad about salad. It's the pinnacle of whiteness. And then someone else again says, what we ate growing up was good food, because today people are just making salads. Doesn't matter what other people is telling you about food, like they can make this salad and that, the new stuff. Ask them to make you a pot of cabbage brie, and then you can see the difference compared to the salads and stuff. So in these narratives, salad stands for what some theorists have termed whiteliness, which I found a useful concept to work with. So a cultural basket of habits, values, and morals relating to food and bodily management. And all the that I just quoted were pointing to and rejecting the racialized power of raw food, salad, to define good food, and by extension to define good taste, good bodies, good people. As one of them says elsewhere, reflecting on growing up in Zimbabwe, and this is the quotation up here, good food was always white food, which is like rice and chicken and salad, coleslaw in particular. Potato salad, oh, potato height of, it's a potato, but in a salad. I mean, come on, it's crazy. So our speakers drew similar links between whiteness and particular forms of caring about food provenance and health. And here's another example about that link between whiteness and health. And then this is moving on. I'm conscious of time. So maybe I'll just say quickly, this is kind of the third absence data, which is the absence of Blackness in imaginaries of vegetarianism and veganism. Now, obviously, there are many Black vegetarians and vegans in South Africa as elsewhere, but the fact of the numbers doesn't diminish the sense that is expressed here that the choice to refuse meat, particularly for so-called ethical reasons, is bound up with whiteness. And there's a sense in which vegetarianism and veganism become an expression of the power to determine whose lives matter the most. Maybe I should just go to the conclusion. So there's is good in the South African context, and Leslie Green's book on where she touches on some of these questions is really useful. And she says even the most cursory glance at South African environmentalism is a confrontation with whiteness of green. And in the discourse around vegetarianism, we can see those connections out as well. So these are big questions that are emerging, I know, towards the end of this presentation, and they emerge at the end of the paper, not because they're less important. They are the most important questions. But my aim in the paper is to not so much address those questions directly, but to argue that these big questions can't be addressed as if they were beyond the realms of the social and the cultural. So if we're going to reach a collective understanding the ethics of meat, which does tie into questions of animal rights and does tie into questions of climate change, we're not going to get there by that circumvents the question of human identities, and it probably won't be through rational argument and persuasion. And feelings and relationships in all their messy spilling all over the place that some of the quotations illustrate for us. So I'll just leave you with another poem that's very much about meat, but I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Shari. Couple of comments from the chat section. Shelley Brooks says, this is very interesting. I think it forms a fascinating counterpoint to this morning's paper about the venison appeal on meat, race and class in South Africa, and sort of reports that farm workers on hunting farms included in their grievances that they were given game meat, and they complain not only about low wages, but also about not getting real meat and what counts as real meat, which I think your story about the elephant meat and people throwing up when they were tricked into believing that they'd eaten something other than what they thought they were. Anyona Undigi says, in my Ekegusi culture in East Africa, there's also been an element of which parts of chicken should be eaten by whom. And I know in some parts of, and some class positions in South Africa, chicken is often not seen as meat. And as a vegetarian, you often go places at a social occasion and you say, I'm vegetarian ahead of time. And they go, oh, the cliched thing. Your options are then chicken or fish. And sometimes even at government occasions, you specify you want the vegetarian food and then you get the anchovy salad. But what I was intrigued by is this notion of racination, particularly by the people that you've subsequently identified as white. When they talk about meat and they project it onto this imagined other, they're doing the work of whiteness, right? Which is Richard Dyer's classic explanation of you cannot ever name it, it is the unexamined center from which the world is viewed. But these are also subjects in post-apartheid, post-millennial South Africa. So to what extent is this a psychic performance that they know at some level rings hollow, but they have nothing else available to them to articulate whiteness in South Africa? And here the spectacle is the food element, because so often in South Africa, whiteness is the nothing, the unexplained, the inexplicable, the unexplained, the blank, the missing bit at the center. It's never fully populated. And the closest we've come, I think, is Coetzee's notion from a generation ago, which is that white culture, he uses white writing, but whiteness itself is the material produced by people who are no longer European, not yet African. And so in that dialectic distance constructed by your two respondents about Black people in Pinetown do the following things. They're performing a notion of whiteness because they can't put content in it themselves. So to what extent are the Black subjects doing something similar and inverse, which is performing a notion of Blackness that's very specific to the South African dynamic of having to populate anew this category that becomes synonymous with Africanity and has all sorts of projections from South Africa onto the rest of the continent. And then there is a comment from somebody else about categories. Anyola says, I do not like the categories of white, colored, and black. I have never seen a white person. I'm brown and all of us have a color. I think all human beings are brown, albeit the fact that shades, but it seems that these social and political colors are here to stay. And here I was thinking of Robert Miles, who says that in social science research, we really shouldn't be using race to make sense of the world, but we should be looking at how others use race to make sense of the world. And to what extent does your project grapple with that problematic of not simply reinscribing the Population Registration Act 1950 and in people's own constructions of themselves inside these interviews and exchanges in those terms? How accurate are their self-descriptions and self-understandings?
Yeah, do you want me to respond now?
Yes, I mean, this is just for you to respond in the next 5 minutes to the other comments.
Yeah, really. Shirley, I very much enjoyed the paper that you and Lindor gave this morning, and it was a different angle on meat. And yeah, it definitely brings other ideas into the mix. Yeah, the race. I mean, Anyona, I that discomfort categories, and would not kind of take them as given, but just said, the way in which people narrate meaning to identify themselves, etc., in terms of race, they are interesting and they are meaningful, and certainly in our did use racial terms to explain things, to explain themselves, to explain relationships, and to explain other people. And so I think that is significant, and I hope that I've been to the way in which they talk about race. Not expect that the discussions about race would come through so strongly in relation to meat. So yeah, that was a surprising finding, and had I known to expect it, I think it would have gone in with a different questions, or certainly more around these issues, these topics. The question about performance is also a really, that's a really intriguing one methodologically, because of course you never really know. People, we are always performing in some way. I know my colleague in the room, and we're writing together about performance from some of this data. So on the one hand, yes, performing, there's always a performative element to what we're doing, and even more so, I think, when you are in a research relationship and you are asking somebody questions and needing them to deliver, and they know that you're wanting them to deliver something, the extent to which they are performing for you is something that you can't always know. So it's a tricky one. It bears a lot more thought, I think. But yeah, I'll take away and continue thinking about.
Thank you so much. There have been responses from Pralini and Shirley about this question of race and performance in the Q&A in the chat section. I'm just had to run out of the rooms for a second because I had a thunderstorm break over my head and all my windows were open, but I kept you in ear. So I think we can move on to the next paper and then come back to the three papers altogether and some of the responses from you, Pralini, and from you, Shari, based on the comments and hopefully the marinading that will have happened in the next half hour throughout. So we will move directly to our next speaker, Ben Jameson Stanley, who is presenting Tainted Food, Fruit, Supermarkets, and Identity in Zoe Wicomb's Playing in the Light.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Angelo. And thanks to the speakers we've heard so far. I really enjoyed both of your talks. Thanks also to our conference organizers and our tech support for keeping us all together here. I'm just going to quickly share my slides. And I also put a comment in the chat that has a link for an access copy of my talk. So if it's useful to anyone to just follow along the written words, you can follow on the access copy. Bear with me just a second while I get my slides. All right. Can someone tell me you're seeing that okay?
Yes, we're seeing it perfectly.
Great. Thanks so much. All right. So my presentation today offers a queer food studies reading of Zoe Wicomb's 2006 novel, Playing in the Light. So I'll be focusing on the meanings of supermarkets and of fruit that the novel activates to capture shifting ideas about identity and about desire in Cape Town in the 1990s. I'll be thinking about Wicomb's novel in dialogue with the phenomenon of supermarketization and also with concepts from queer theory. In my reading, Playing in the Light explores both how grocery shopping patterns can ossify the hierarchies of racialized global capitalism, and how interactions with food can nonetheless create space for individuals to rethink their own identities. I argue that Wicomb's motifs of supermarket shopping and fruit emphasize how normative identities are formed through consumer capitalism, yet also explore how acts of consumption can be queer. And I'm using queer here in a really broad sense of disrupting normative identity categories. So I will read Food and Playing in the Light as articulating a non-prescriptive queerness that both is and isn't about non-normative sexual desire, and that disrupts the ways in which racial and class identities are regimented through consumerism. So Playing in the Light follows Marion Campbell, who is a white-identified businesswoman in 1990s Cape Town, who discovers in the course of the novel that her parents were so-called play whites, meaning persons once classified as colored who had passed as white during apartheid. So having been raised as white, Marion wonders whether or not to continue identifying in that way or kind of re-narrate herself. The novel thus probes the social construction of race as it intersects with class and with desire in a Cape Town that is entering neoliberal globalization. In the first part of this paper, I'm going to talk about how Wicomb uses shopping at Woolworths to represent the performance of middle-class whiteness. And I'll also be elaborating here on how Wicomb locates both the middle-class home and the supermarket as sites where a white cis heterosexual normativity is enforced through capitalist temporalities. So the character Marion's food shopping habits are indicative in the novel of her performance of whiteness and of middle classness. We're told over and over again that Marion shops at Woolworths, which is an upscale department store and supermarket chain. So, for example, Marion brings her father groceries, unpacking a Woolworths bag of fruit into a cut glass bowl. Or Marion says that she'll leave some prepared dinners from Woolworths in the fridge. You mustn't shop at Woolworths, her father says. It's too expensive. Woolworths represents bourgeois tastes in this novel, and it is strongly associated with the character Marion. This meaning of Woolworths, I think, transpires in dialogue with the phenomenon of supermarketization. So supermarketization is a term that refers to the spread of supermarket chains as a means of food access, especially in parts of the global South. And this was a trend very much encouraged by neoliberalism. And supermarketization shifts the terms of food access in ways that are quite class specific. So, for example, in Cape Town, where Playing in the Light is set, supermarketization has been very skewed across different neighborhoods by income. And informal food vendors remain a really important node of food access, which also remains quite precarious for lower income Cape Townians. This is all according to a 2015 study. So in that context, Marion's association with the supermarket, and specifically with Woolworths, encodes her privilege as a middle-class person raised to identify as white. This is an example of how consumer habits related to food become performances of particular identity markers, indeed become constitutive of identity. The linking of Marion to the supermarket also connotes the broader atomization and rigidity of life under racialized capitalism. Wicomb situates that atomization as kind of particularly intensified by the childhood experience of so-called passing. So thinking about her childhood, Marion recalls a house with endless rules and restrictions, with closed doors that locked her out. And this regimentation stems from Marion's mother, Helen, being anxious to pass. So Wicomb writes that Helen was alerted to the many shades of whiteness, and there was no need to settle for anything other than the brightest, which to her meant a kind of middle-class Englishness. And so to perform that identity, Helen chops their life up into these regularized temporal units. So this is described in the novel in terms of parceled days or tightly wrapped days. Through the character Helen, Wicomb draws out how intersecting racial, class, and gendered identities are regimented by the temporalities of the middle-class home. The novel suggests that to pass as white and to be middle class entails this rigid management of affect, of space, and of time. And in the longer chapter that this talk is coming from, I think about this a little bit with queer theorist Elizabeth Freeman's concepts of chrononormativity and domestic time. Regimentation of time and space in Playing in the Light evokes specific apartheid restrictions, but yet those structures don't simply just vanish after apartheid ends. Instead, they are reformulated in the terms of neoliberal capitalism. And I think Playing the Light is a lot about those kinds of reformulations in the 1990s moment. And part of what I'm suggesting today is that supermarketization is an important aspect of that kind of reformulation. So a key image in the novel of capitalist temporality being enforced by passing is a set of trays of apples that Marion imagines. And so this is the post-apartheid adult Marion thinking back about her childhood. This image links middle-class whiteness to the normalization of food via industrial agriculture and supermarket distribution. So this is that image. Secrets, lies, and discomfiture. That was what her childhood had been wrapped in, each day individually wrapped. Before her, an image arises, the past laid out in uniform trays of apples, wrapped in purple tissue paper. Marion loves apples. It is irksome that something she finds delicious should now be infected, a drop of poison hidden in the core, under the wholesome, glossy skin. So this image of uniform trays of apples with a drop of poison borrows its uncanny power from anxieties about industrial food. Consumer products could contain harmful unknown substances, and they're certainly tied to social inequalities that control who can eat what, who can own what. Linking such menaces to skin, Wicomb's apple tray image connotes a class system that's buttressed by racial hierarchy. Under the skin of the seemingly perfect packaged apple lies the poison of differentiated privilege. And that's a kind of ugly reality of social inequality that Marion, as an adult, is just beginning to confront. And as an aside, I think you could also differently read the language about the drop of poison here in terms of like racist anxieties about so-called blood contamination, but that's kind of a bit of a different reading than what I'm offering today. Also key to this image of the apple trays is the language of normalized time, with each day individually wrapped, like an apple. The tightly packaged apples from the supermarket are not only a metaphor for the regimentation of identity, but they're actually a nod to the ways in which patterns of food access materially determine daily and weekly routines. Those routines are differentiated by class, by race, by gender, and so food consumption patterns are key to taxonomies of identity. Interfacing with the food system is a quotidian way in which we live race and class identities as a form of temporal regulation. Supermarketization boxes Marion into particular patterns, even as it excludes poorer consumers. So the supermarket creates this formalization and rigidity that both constrains Marion and simultaneously marks her as privileged. Fruit from the supermarket functions as what I call a tainted food. And by a tainted food, I mean a food that has negative connotations from a progressive or radical food political perspective. So a food that is associated with violence, with exploitation, with environmental damage, what have you. In the case of Wicomb's novel, Fruit from the Supermarket is tainted in that it represents the performance of this oppressive middle-class cis heterosexual whiteness. So far I've been emphasizing the normative meanings attached to supermarkets and to fruit and playing in the light. But now I'm going to discuss some ways in which Fruit from the Supermarket also comes to represent a loosening of the hierarchies of race, sexuality, and global capitalism in this novel. As Marion's racial identity destabilizes, fruit becomes a sign of queer possibilities. And this is particularly true in the ambiguous dynamic between Marion and a character named Brenda. Brenda, a young woman who identifies as colored and/or Black, enters the story as a new employee at Marion's travel agency, and she slowly becomes the second protagonist in the novel. Marion is initially drawn to Brenda in a way that tokenizes Brenda's racial identity. So Marion is trying to learn about a maid who used to work for her family, and she kind of absurdly assumes that Brenda might know the maid's family. But Brenda ends up accompanying Marion on a research trip in which they discover that the maid was actually Marion's grandmother. And this is what makes Marion realize that her own parents had once been classified as colored. This revelation is followed by a striking scene of queer intimacy between Marion and Brenda. Brenda is sleeping on Marion's couch, and she wakes up because Marion is having a nightmare. Marion thrashes, moans, and weeps so pitifully that Brenda goes to soothe her to try to wake her up. Marion clings for dear life and shudders with sobs. Brenda can do nothing but lie down on the bed and hold Marion tightly in her arms, stroke the shaking shoulders, rest her cheek on Marion's face to keep her from rising. Marion clings to her until the taut, arched body finally stops shaking and the breathing subsides. Helpless as a baby, her arms are tightly wrapped around Brenda. Her head rests on Brenda's breast. Like lovers, they wake together, still entwined. For seconds, they lie stock still. Then Marion disentangles herself, limb by limb. So this image of Marion's body taut and arched until her breathing subsides reads like a description of an orgasm and its denouement, and the women wake like lovers. So clearly there's a kind of queer eroticism to this scene, but it's also quite ambiguous. Brenda is cast not only as a lover, but as a maternal figure. Marion is also cast as a baby. The women's bodily intimacy could represent the convergence of their racial identities, or Marion's sense of Brenda as some kind of model. In other words, same-sex intimacy might be rendered important not in and of itself, but as a metaphor for racial affiliation. As Andrew van der Vlies has suggested, the queer energy of Wickham's fiction comes from characters who disrupt normative expectations of them in relation to gender, ethnicity, or behavior, whether or not they identify as queer in sexual orientation. So rather than seeing concern with sexuality or with race as a kind of either or in this scene, I read Marion and Brenda's relationality as being both about same-sex intimacy and also about the dynamic social construction of race. The nature of the affinity between them is really hard to pin down, and I think that's precisely the point. In a novel that asks what possibilities are left in the wake of apartheid's racial taxonomies and sexual prohibitions, and also amidst economic liberalization, queerness offers a mode of thinking beyond categorization, a radical undefinability that emerges out of Marion's unsureness about her racial identity. This range of meanings unfurls as Marion and Brenda move from the bedroom to the kitchen, where they eat fruit from Woolworth's. In the kitchen, there is a bowl of peaches, which Brenda prods for ripeness. "Dare I eat a peach?" Brenda calls theatrically. "I never understood it," she says, "the idea of being challenged by a peach. But it's simple, isn't it? Refined people struggle with the possibility because of the juice that will dribble down their chins. So the answer to Prufrock is to eat the fruit before it's ripe, or to tackle it with a knife and fork." "Nonsense," Marion says. "It's about eating fruit when it looks perfect, before it's over the hill. Firm, perfect shape, perfect color." Brenda snorts, the gospel according to St. Woolworth's, packed in polystyrene and labeled ripe when the rest of us know that ripeness doesn't go with perfect. So Brenda kind of scoffs at Woolworth's here, and in that way resituates Marion in relation to this middle class, kind of white-coated set of shopping patterns. At the same time, Brenda quotes a line about peach eating from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and that marks Brenda herself as a university-educated person. Indeed, peaches index a range of race and class markers in this scene, as well as desires. On the next page, Brenda suggests that Marion is now Black, and so she's therefore free to be noisy, free to eat a peach, a juicy, ripe one, and free of the burdens of nation and tradition. So Brenda is using peach eating to associate Black or colored identity with a kind of cultural freedom, with escaping the taint of white nationalist history. But peaches aren't literally free, and I think that matters in a novel where fruit from Woolworth's is kind of standing in for privilege. Brenda's line potentially ironizes the idea of cultural or legal freedom without economic opportunity. Peach eating also becomes eroticized. Brenda dips a couple of peaches briefly into boiling water and slips off the skins. "I love the way it comes off," she says, holding the slippery, naked fruit between two fingertips before biting into it. She wipes the dribbling juice with the back of her hand. So this line extends the homoerotics of the nightmare scene, but the slippery, naked fruit then immediately transforms from this sensual image into one that's more about failed racial identity. Marion stares at her peach. She cannot bring herself to eat it. Naked, slippery. That's me. That's who I am, she thinks. Hurled into the world fully grown, without a skin. So the peach evokes several different co-present meanings here. There's a kind of blurring between erotic desire, affiliation, racial identification, kind of disorientation about racial identity. The queer erotics of the peach do introduce those feelings of disorientation and loss for Marion, but also productively destabilize Marion's compulsion to racially sort and temporally regulate herself. There's a suggestion in this peach eating scene that perhaps taxonomies held over from apartheid can soften, and perhaps the global capitalist rigidities of productivity and efficiency can soften too. In Playing in the Light, then, fruits from the supermarket index the oppressiveness of consumer capitalism, rigid racial categorization, the normative family, and their expected time intervals. Yet at the same time, fruits from the supermarket also open up these queer possibilities. So by way of concluding, I want to just contextualize a little bit the politics of that queerness. I think that Wicomb's queering of rigid identity categories is particularly interesting because it cuts back against what I would call neoliberal queer culture, in which queer identity is sometimes leveraged to reinforce white privilege or Western ideas of identity or capitalist consumerism. And a little bit of context on that from South Africanist queer studies. Brenna Munro has argued that in post-apartheid public culture, gay rights were presented as a key sign of the democratic values of the new nation, a kind of litmus test for an equal society. So contra the discourse that homosexuality is un-African, a very different narrative emerges here of gay friendliness as modern, as evidence of South Africa's readiness in the 1990s to enter global society. But that narrative has its own problems because it can tend to reduce queer politics to what's called homocapitalism, which refers to the selective incorporation into capitalism of some queers, typically white, middle class, and cisgendered gays, and the disavowal of other queers through a liberal politics of recognition that obviates the need for redistribution of resources. So one way that this homocapitalism has manifested in South African cities is the development of kind of tourist-facing commercial gay culture with bars that have Western names, such as the Bronx and Gotham City, as Neville Hode has noted. This trend speaks to the spread of normative Western-style gay identity in lockstep with neoliberal capitalism. But what we're seeing in Wicomb's novel is a really different set of queer meanings. The peach, as this locus of same-sex intimacy, creates an opportunity to probe how queerness could become narratable beyond a prescriptive Western gay rights frame. Wicomb is asking, how can queerness signify otherwise? And simultaneously, how can our relations with food avoid ossifying oppressive identity hierarchies and instead move us in the direction of liberation? So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ben. While we wait for questions for them, we will. I'll make a remark. It's fascinating to me that, I mean, I'd never thought of Playing in the Light as a queer text or a text that encourages any kind of queer reading. But that's also because it's the least favorite of the Wicombs for me. It's for me well, actually, no, it's the second after October. But it's fascinating that this queerness and Woolworths in the imagined Cape Town of Wicomb's text ignores the materiality of queerness and Woolworths in the actual material Cape Town, right? Because Woolworths has its own history of racializing Cape Town. So Labour preference policies that were deeply kind of structured around phenotypes. So they first hired only white people to work in it, and then they would hire a certain kind of black subject who phenotypically presented as near white, so straight hair, sharp features, to use the language of that kind of raciological discourse. But also in the Cape Town of the 1990s, there's also a very specific queer element about Woolworths because of the way in which queer white men become significant in the management and re-articulation of the store. Because in the 1980s, Woolworths is a clothing store with a certain small food section. In the 1990s, it becomes Marks and Spencer's redux south of the equator. And here I find that the problem for me in your reading, or problematic that I need to think through, is if the novel is queer and Wicomb or has this queer sensibility, and Wicomb is such a close reader of that nuance, is there a blind spot in Wicomb's reading? Is it because of the distance of time and space from which she writes the novel in the 2000s about a 1990s Cape Town that she may know in a certain way as an eye, as a subject observing it, and as a writer writing about it? And do we give her too much credit for the spectacular misreading and missing out of the actual queer stuff, given this, because this queering of food also comes up in her 1990 short story, Another Story, in which she talks about how food has grown rotten in the fridge and needs to be taken out. And so new terms need to be invented. And is Playing in the Light, in your sense, an attempt to create those new terms beyond the old categories of not just race, but these other categories that you speak of?
Well, thank you, Angelo. So, thank you so much, because that is a totally fascinating set of like additional meanings attached to Woolworths for me to think about. So I'm really appreciative of that kind of history that you drew out about Woolworths. I mean, I think in terms of how Woolworths appears in the novel itself, it is maybe like most loudly associated with middle class whiteness, and maybe that is looser from the kind of association of cis heterosexuality as a vector then might be taken away from my presentation. But I do think in that scene of peach eating, it's how these different signifiers are like mobile and intersecting and in flux with one another that really comes out. So Woolworths is like explicitly present in that scene, right? And we're, I think, meant to think that these peaches are from Woolworths, and Woolworths is again like asserted as this marker of like, oh, like you're being so middle class, you're being so posh, in the way that Brenda kind of talks to Marion about it. And I think implicitly still you're being so white, right? Even as Brenda says to Marion, hey, now you know you're Black, like you can like let go of some of this like rigidity, right? At the same time as the peaches are these like erotic markers in this scene of potential queer intimacy between Marion and Brenda. And it's like those different meanings never quite lining up or syncing up with each other, right? It's like it's more about the instability of what the food might mean than anything else. So that'd be a kind of initial answer to you, but I'm excited to think more about what you were saying about Woolworths. So thank you so much for that.
There are comments from Shirley, who wonders whether the broad argument about supermarkets in the food studies work cited applies as directly to Woolworths as to mass supermarkets, Pick and Pay, and so on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shirley. So I think you look at just what is actually dominating the food retail market in South Africa, it is more like Pick and Pay, right? And one other as well. It's not Woolworths so much. And I think talking about kind of access to supermarkets across class, you know, this is a question of where supermarkets are located, but it's also a more complicated question than that, right? So there are the study that I cited by Jane Battersby and a couple of other folks discusses how even if you have a supermarket located nearby a lower income neighborhood, it might or might not actually be useful to the people who are living there, because informal vendors, by virtue of their own precarity, are likelier to offer options like buying on informal credit, right? Whereas you can't necessarily get that as at the supermarket, right? So how supermarkets do or don't kind of make food access easier is really like quite a complicated issue. And definitely other markets like Pick and Pay are a big part of that. I think it's significant that it is Woolworths in the novel, right? And that Woolworths, I think, you know, I'm interested what other people think, but to me it scans in the novel as this association with a kind of like poshness, right? Whereas I think Pick and Pay might not scan in quite that same way, were Wicomb to have invoked it.
Israel Lewis has a question. She says, related to this, can you explain how you see the novel critiquing or exposing capitalism as opposed to its offering a more general and looser indictment of materialism, characters' commodity fixation and class aspirations, etc.? And then Shari says, Woolworths occupies a really interesting place in their data too, definitely special, or the place people go to for particular foods like meat, but also its specialness, aspirational status is contested.
Yeah, thank you for both of those thoughts. In terms of the novel's critique of capitalism, to try to answer Desiree's question, I think it's about a couple of different things. So I think it's about how this idea that there are these like rigid intervals of how we live our life. This is an idea that queer theorists like Elizabeth Freeman have very much associated with capitalism, right? That capitalism kind of pushes on us this like prescriptive efficiency, and also all these temporalities of like, you're supposed to go to work from 9 to 5, you're supposed to come home, there's this like domestic time in which women are supposed to serve dinner, right? These are like long-term kind of temporalities associated with capitalism. And part of what I'm still like thinking about here is how to articulate the ways in which those are maintained versus shift in the kind of transition to neoliberal capitalism specifically that South Africa is undergoing in this 1990s moment that Playing in the Light is concerned with. I definitely think that the novel's references to food are so consistently about buying food and about where food is bought that I think we're being asked to think about the consumption of food as a kind of like special or paradigmatic case of consumption in the sense of buying things in a capitalist system. And that's being kind of like held up for scrutiny for in what ways does Marion construct her identity, her very like posh middle class identity, through the ways that she buys things and through her kind of assumption that she'll be able to buy what she wants, right? So that's kind of how I see it coming in the novel. And Shari, thank you for the comment about your data. That's really helpful to hear as well. Yeah, thank you for all of these questions and comments. This has been really helpful to me as I'm continuing to think about this work.
Are there other questions? It's fascinating to me that, you know, to some extent, the Woolworth shopping is a playing in the light, and a continued playing in the light for Marion that is as repressed or unconscious as the playing in the light of her forebears was conscious and then repressed. And some of Brenda's remarks is to call out the repression and to remind Marion that this is continued playing in the light. But the question, and this is where I think Shari's point comes in, is to what extent that contestation in the novel is more about the imagined Cape Town of Wicomb's view than it is about the materiality, because you invoke Jane Battersby and others who are doing research on people's behavior and conduct and attitudes in the material world. And it's interesting to contrast that with Wicomb's refiguration of such conduct in these very specific imagined discursive terms of the novel, of the, you know, enacting of space. And I think sometimes, I mean, my reading of Wicomb is that after David's story, she moves further and further from the material spaces that South Africa is moving into and remains in the imagined space of South Africa and is looking back from that space in a way that's very different from people who imagine 1990s South Africa and its contestations, who've continued to be inside the country. And so these nuances that you point to for me are very productive. I just think that I wonder to what extent there's also something missing in Wicomb's gaze, particularly since you've now unearthed and revealed the queer. In the novel's figuration, when actually there is another queer aspect to those sights and scenes that don't seem to figure for either Marion or her narrator.
Yeah, no, that's super fascinating. Thank you so much, Angelo and others, for these comments. I will continue to sit with them.
Okay, since there are no further questions to Ben, I suggest that all three speakers come up to the stage, put their cameras and mics on, and we begin to think of the conversations that you're having with one another, because I think when listening to the three presentations, what for me is the link is both the remembered and misremembered, the imagined, the desired in relation to food, whether it is in the first presentation, Pralini's figuration, renegotiation, and articulation of the relationship with recipe books and the mother, whether it is in Shari's work on people's imagined relations with categories of food and categories of identity and belonging, and notions of self and other, and in Ben's reading of Wicomb's construction of the radical instability of such notions of belonging through food and belonging through processes around food. How would you see yourselves kind of now responding to one another, having heard all three of the presentations?
Can I just jump in?
Absolutely.
It was so lovely and kind of surprising, and I didn't quite know what to expect from the titles. But to see the connections in terms of, you know, how we're all thinking about race and identity and aspects of identity, and it is such a messy space, but food is such a productive space to be thinking these through. And Anyona's comments, I think, have also pushed us all to be, really thinking into that mess, because these categories are very meaningful to many people, most people perhaps in this country, and have material effects, and they play out in material ways. And so, yeah, I really appreciated the different ways in which, presenters here have unpacked those.
Because I think you're also each dealing with a different way of people presenting themselves as text or text. Literally, in Ben's case, Shari is looking at the textual refiguration of people's speech, which itself becomes a form of text if we go via J.L. Austin's speech acts. And then Pralini is looking at sometimes literal text in front of her, but also the text of memory, and how one matches and mismatches the misremembered and remembered past with what's in front of one, and how what triggers what. How do we think of food as being encoded in text? And I mean, as one of the keynote speakers, one of his points was he wishes he could cook for us so that we could smell the food. And the problem with writing about food and talking about food is that sorry, that's thunder rippling through my building. The reality of food is that it's very rarely not about its taste and texture and smell and all the other things, which is missing when we talk when it is reduced to text. And the sensual is what I'm thinking of, which Wicomb tries to do with the peaches, which people talk about when they feel contemptuous of potato salad or coleslaw. When Pralini gives us that rich description of the alchemy between the mother's fingers and the food reaching for the child's lips. How do you bring that back? And not you, we, all of us, when we think and write and talk about food, the one thing that's missing is the thing that makes food important to us, or the things that are missing.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I totally get the point that, yes, the materiality is not there, but equally I would argue that, the words and the material, the words and the world are not that separate that suggests. So, I mean, when Pralini was talking, I couldn't obviously in my body smell, taste, feel the textures, but it was there, and I think my corporeal response to her speaking and to the images that she was showing. And I think maybe I have thought about these questions in other spaces, not so much with food, but I think this would also be a fruit, to take a food metaphor, a fruitful space to explore the interconnections between the words and the meanings that might seem ephemeral, but are very much a part and parcel of the material experience of food. So not to separate those realms out completely as if they were, opposed to each other, because they're not.
Really see that in some of your data that you were sharing with us, Shari, where the expectations that we have about what do I think this food means, or like what kinds of identities do I associate it with, those are going to determine things about what food people buy, right, and what food they eat, right? So there is this like co-constitutive relationship between kind of attitudes or narratives about what we think food means and kind of our interactions with it. Absolutely. I'm so interested to ask you more, Shari, about the question of middle classness, which came up really differently in your talk and in mine, I think. So whereas I'm more kind of charting this novelistic rendering where middle class functions as a really kind of hegemonic category, I was seeing something much more expansive than that in your talk. I don't know if you would want to share just a little bit more about kind of you had signposted this at the beginning that we could talk more about, like how was middle class defined for this study, or why was that the category you were thinking with? I'd be really interested to hear that if you're willing to share.
Yes, of course. Why we chose middle class people, middle class participants, sort of lost a little bit in the mists of time, but it came out of collaboration, and there were particular agendas that shaped that aspect of the research project. But then once we had said, okay, we're looking at middle class populations in these three cities, we had to do a lot of work to say, well, who counts as middle class in South Africa? What does that mean? There's quite a lot of sort of quantitative sociological writing on, who is the middle class, who is the new middle class, who is the new Black middle class. People are actually very exercised about the question of class in South Africa. And we, partly because, this is a collaborative project with colleagues in the UK as well as here. So that's why I keep saying we, I'm not using the royal we. We were all kind of qualitatively inclined, and we didn't want to predetermine what counted as class in kind of income brackets, using the living standards income brackets in a kind of narrow sense. And so we went with a more kind of understanding of middle classes that can be a little bit hard to define if people, sorry, it can be a little bit hard to defend if people are wanting a number, because we can't give them a number. But we did ask people how they identified. So we went with self-identification, and then we tried to sort of bring in elements of, how people talk about their identity in a broader sense, how they perform their identity. For example, where do they shop? And where do they live, and education. And so, without creating a matrix, we try to incorporate these different ways of kind of living and narrating middle classness.
Does nobody use the Marxist definition of class anymore? As somebody who's been out of the academy for 10 years, I'm curious. As relationship to means of production.
We did not.
Okay. Desiree had a question, which I think was mostly also aimed at Pralini, but it picks up something else that I think, also you're in, both because you, Ben, you're dealing with an artistic text, and Shari, you're dealing with people who are constructing themselves in language. And so I didn't, mean that we separate. I did take the linguistic term, that we separate people's constructions of themselves in language from their performance. Pralini is back. Okay, so she can answer Desiree's question to her.
Okay, which one is this?
Desiree wants to know, does the proximity of the corporeal and the sensual and such not have a lot to do with the kinds of texts we produce, which genres we use? And she'd really like for you to talk more about the reasons for your choice of genre, anti-genre. Why you choose not to, put yourself in a genre or not.
Sorry, I'm on the back foot here because I've so much of.
Shall I give you a minute or two?
Yeah,
to
give me a
think about
moment
that?
just to.
Okay.
Yeah,
And then Pamela Geisman has asked, how did they define their middle classness to Shari?
So shall I just jump in while Pralini is thinking? So it varied a lot. I mean, we had, over 100 participants, I think, and as you can imagine, people gave all kinds of answers to the question of, how would you identify? And we sort of framed the question on how would you identify yourself in the context of South Africa, and people chose all sorts of things. Some people did name middle class, Some people were very clear that they were upper class in the context of South Africa, and I think they were thinking about income brackets in that sense. And then for some people who didn't kind of specify or engage in that conversation explicitly, we drew from other observations, and we kind of made the judgment that they counted as middle class based on that basket of factors.
Pralini, I feel like we're putting you on the spot, that you missed out a whole section of the discussion. What I'll
So
probably
genre
do
and
is...
anti-genre and kind of my sort of discomfort with it, maybe, with the genre, or I don't know what the background conversation was.
I can't remember what we were talking about at that point either.
Yeah,
so,
context
I think
would help. Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to where I actually got kicked out was when Shari was talking about the messiness of where we're at. And, some of these ideas around food, around seed, around recipes, all of those kinds of things are giving us platforms with which to grapple with these categories, because they are categories, right? There's categories of race and there's categories of ethnicity and all of those things. We don't like talking about them too much, but they're there, and they impact on lives, and they impact on on realities. And so I think those are lenses that can that where we can kind of trouble these very sort of rigid notions that we've obviously inherited, that we bring back into our language, and that we haven't actually we haven't moved out of. And so looking at the reason, I mean, my poem is pretty tongue-in-cheek in some ways. This idea of tradition and the idea of heritage and the idea of authenticity, it's quite intentional that actually there's a thread, of course, to my ancestry. I want to recognize that thread to my ancestry, but I'm making it up as I go along. There's some very, I could today say those dreams were really real. When I opened my mother's coffee grinder, that's real. It is real. It is real in that moment. At the same time, there is an agency. There's an agency in the storying, I mean, I am one of those people that use a story to kind of give context to what I'm saying. My grandmother, as storied by my mother, I don't know how real that was. It was real to her at the time. But I do know that she used to also tell us stories of her favorite movie. And she had made this movie so fascinating for us that we all wanted to watch this movie. Eventually, when we got to watch it, it was a completely different movie. She had embellished it, and it was the most exciting movie from the way she had told it. So there's all of this, there's it's such a generative space, recipe as well as story. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'm not sure if I've answered Desiree's question. I haven't. I don't think I have.
No, I think you have answered the question, because I think, or responded to it. I don't think it was necessarily we were looking for an answer, but we were curious about the notion of the generic construction of story, and the way in which you proceed to do it is not through the traditional forms of either you could have done a recipe book of your mother's recipes. That's one way of storying. You could have just done a poem inspired by texts we would never see and think of and know of. But you chose to combine those with a reflection that was also autobiographical, and our interest therefore was, I think, about how you invent the genre and break the genre in the ways that Ben talks about the characters breaking down those categorical boundaries, which in that book is not just about food, but it's also about the feather of the guinea fowl. And for Shari's respondent, certainly, ironically, I found, to go back to Pralini's irony, is that when these people spoke about race, they were exploding so many of the ideas about race, which they then cleaved themselves back onto. And that for me is always one of the motions of South Africans' engagement with race. They explode the categories, but then cleave themselves onto it, because so much fear resides in what happens after we abandon categorical thinking, whether it is about food and authenticity, about race and authenticity, about class and identity and authenticity, or about being and performance rather than being and authenticity. Thank you so much to all three speakers for the productive engagement and for, giving us so much to think of. I think we are expected to end the session now. We're 2 minutes overdue and go to a meet and greet. I don't know what that means. Presumably we go back into the room with the tables. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm now tempted to go and reread my copy of Playing in the Light, even though I really disliked the novel when I first read it and read it again. But I shall, persevere. I'm going to go in prospecting for the queer in Playing in the Light. Thank you so much. I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Angelo. And thanks, Pralini. Lovely to meet you.
Yeah, lovely to meet you all. Thanks for your papers. Thanks, Angelo, for hosting.